Hello and welcome to the Science Set Free podcast. My name is Mark Vernon and I'm sitting here talking with Rupert Sheldrake. Hello, Rupert.
Hello, Mark.
We're going to start with the question, is materialism inherently atheistic? I wonder why you wanted to ask this question to get us going.
Because a lot of people who are materialists are atheists. And there are different reasons for being materialists and atheists, and I wanted to see if we could disentangle them. Some people are atheists because they hate the idea of God, or they've had bad experiences with religion, or they're anti-clerical, or whatever, for personal, social, or philosophical reasons. But that doesn't necessarily imply a scientific worldview. Now, science is currently based on materialism, and that's essentially a scientific theory or philosophy. And can we disentangle it from the whole issue of atheist versus religious controversies? Can materialism be a scientific theory in its own right, or are the two inextricably bound up together? Is it possible to have a materialism that's not atheistic, or even for that question, atheism that's not materialist?
So the idea would be to identify what materialism really is and examine it on its own account.
Yes.
So I wonder whether it's possible then to give us a starter for 10 definition of what materialism is, and perhaps also drawing out why it may be different from things like a mechanistic view of the universe.
Well, that's a good starting point. Materialism is essentially the doctrine that matter's the only reality. That's what it's saying. Now, in its modern form, of course, it has to include fields and energy. Karl Popper said that through modern physics, by which he mainly meant quantum physics, materialism has transcended itself. Because old-style materialism said matter's the only reality. But matter itself is now explained in terms of fields and energy. Matter itself is a process, not a thing. It's not made up of little billiard balls that sort of endure forever. It's even electrons or atoms are vibratory patterns of activity. So matter itself is now explained in terms of energy and fields, energy bound within fields, and electrons are vibration in an electron field. So that form of materialism, the modern form, is better called physicalism, but I usually use the word materialism because it's a familiar word, and it usually is taken to mean physicalism by its modern supporters.
But to differentiate it, say, from an ancient materialism like the Epicureans believed, where everything is just atoms of various sorts. They believed there were kind of spirit atoms as well as matter atoms. But this modern view would be to embrace fields and energy, as you say.
That's right, yes. But like old-style materialism, it's based, which was based on atoms moving in the void, it's basically saying those are the only reality, there's nothing else. And the old-style materialists like Epicurus liked their belief system because they could get rid of gods. It got rid of gods. I mean, their motives were atheistic. And Lucretius, who in his book De Rerum Natura, that the Latin version of materialism and atomism, which had a big influence in Europe, was again propagating that kind of belief.
So what modern physicalism or materialism is really saying is that everything that exists in the natural world is everything that science has taken it to be in the modern world. There aren't any supernatural or spooky forces or energies at play in things as well. That's
right, including the mind. And this is where what makes it different from mechanism, which is your second point. When we look in a historical perspective, what we find is in the 17th century, the beginning of modern science, most founders of modern science, all of them, Descartes, Newton, Galileo, Kepler, Robert Boyle, were Christians, and they didn't want an atheistic view of nature. And in fact, Robert Boyle deliberately chose the word corpuscle instead of atom because of the atheistic associations of atomism. What they were dualists. They said that the whole of nature is made up of unconscious matter. It's machine-like, lacking in purpose, lacking in mind. But, in addition, there's this mysterious supernatural or non-material realm, which includes human minds, angels, and God, the world of spirit, as opposed to matter, which doesn't obey material principles. And angels and God are not beings with earthly bodies, but humans are. So this created this famous Cartesian dualism. It separates people from the rest of animals and nature, because we're the only ones with minds. And it separates the mind from the body, because this immaterial mind interacts with the mechanical, unconscious body in a small region of the brain. He thought the pineal gland. Modern dualists have moved it a couple of inches into the cerebral cortex. But that was essentially a radical dualism, and one of the functions was to separate the realms of science and religion. Scientists could go on investigating the entire universe, the stars, the planets, animals, plants, but leaving the realm of the spirit to religion. And this enabled them to have a fairly peaceful coexistence for a long time. But then, by the 19th century, increasing numbers of people didn't like dualism. They thought two was too many things to have in the universe. They wanted to be monists. They wanted to have just one thing. So they could go in one of two directions. The idealists said everything's spirit or mind, and matter's just a kind of dulled consequence of habitual mind. The other route is, of course, materialism, denying that spirit exists as a separate or different entity. So at one stroke you get rid of angels and God, which it moves it very strongly in an atheist direction. And then you also get rid of the human mind as being anything different from the brain. So that leads to the view that the mind is nothing but the activity of the brain.
But of course this then raises the very tricky problem of how you explain something like consciousness, which, even a cursory look at it, doesn't look just like something that's the product of matter.
No, and this is why philosophers of mind have been, materialist philosophers of mind have been going round in circles for a very long time, trying to basically explain away consciousness, saying it's an illusion, it doesn't do anything, it has no function, it's simply something produced by the brain, but that's like a shadow of brain activity, an epiphenomenon that doesn't do anything. And they've been trying to put forward ways of explaining it away for decades now, unsatisfactorily, and this is why in consciousness studies this is called the hard problem. The very existence of consciousness is a hard problem. And I think what's interesting about this, you see, is that some materialists are breaking ranks. They're now saying, well, if we say that human consciousness has emerged in human brains at some stage in history, or that consciousness emerged in pre-human animals, and you've basically got a reinvention of Cartesian dualism with the miraculous appearance of consciousness from matter at some stage in the past. And so some materialist philosophers like Galen Strawson have gone over to a different point of view, and he wrote a key paper called Does Materialism Imply Panpsychism? By which he meant, is there some kind of mind or mentality in all self-organizing systems, including electrons and atoms?
So this is this word panpsychism, that the psychic component of our experience, as it were, isn't just our experience, but it goes all the way down into the most simple constituents of matter as well.
That's right. There's some kind of mentality, even in an electron.
Is it possible to give some sense of what that mentality might be like? I mean, is it saying that somehow electrons know, not in the way that we know, but they have some sense of themselves, and so they behave, therefore, like electrons should? Is that too silly a thing to say?
Well, Galen Strawson doesn't give us much clue as to how it might work, and I think the person who's most interesting on this is Alfred North Whitehead, because in his philosophy of organism, put forward in the 1920s, much influenced by quantum physics, he argues that the difference between the mental and the physical pole of an electron or an atom or of any self-organizing system is not one of space. It's not that the mind's inside, the body's outside, but time. The mind is the future pole. It's concerned with possibilities and decisions among possibilities. Once it's made a decision, then some physical change happens, and that's immediately in the past, and that's measurable objectively. Now, in our own case, our minds are very much concerned with possibilities and choosing among them. Every one of us has endless possibilities we could choose at any moment. But when we choose one of them, then that becomes an observable fact. The fact that you and I are sitting here talking to each other now is because we chose to do this at some time in the past when this was a future possibility. We could have done other things at this particular moment instead. But now we're doing it. It's an objective fact, and it's being recorded, and it's a scientific objective fact. The same actually is true of electrons. The Schrödinger wave equation gives you an estimate of all the possible things an electron could do. It inhabits a world of possibility. It's not a physical fact, the wave equation. It lives in the realm of possibility or probability. Now, as soon as the electron interacts with something, all those possibilities collapse down to one observable interaction, which is now a fact in the past. And the choice may not be made through rational deliberation. It probably isn't. It may be due to chance. But the fact is there's still a selection out of many possibilities. And as soon as that's happened, the possibilities collapse down to an observable fact, and a new set of possibilities start to emerge.
And in that picture, the role of the observer might be important too. So it's not just one electron, as it were, deciding what to do, but you have to consider perhaps the system as a whole and the interactions that are taking place.
Exactly, yes. And but I think we get a false idea if we concentrate too much on observers in physics labs, although quantum physicists discuss this in terms of the observer who decides what to observe and what kind of experiment to do. I think this happens every time an electron reacts with anything, an electron in a chemical reaction. When something's burning, when oil's burning, the oil molecules break up to produce carbon dioxide and water, and there's lots of changes in the electrons there. Those involve a change in, from one open set of possibilities to something else. So that's a kind, to use the word observation is straining the word too much, but that's the kind of process which leads to collapse of wave functions.
Do you think that one of the problems with this panpsychism is that it can feel a bit like it's trying to smuggle in the spirit or the mental sort of through the back door, saying it's there really, but it's just somehow wrapped up tightly with the material?
Well, maybe, but the alternative, which is why Galen Strawson has chosen this, the alternative is to be an out-and-out materialist and say that it just appears. We can't explain it. We don't know what it does. We don't know what its function is. The mind, which we depend on to do science, is utterly mysterious, and it's the hard problem which has been insoluble for decades, if not centuries. Or, to go back frankly to Cartesian dualism, and say, okay, there's something quite separate from matter that interacts with it, and mind is essentially supernatural, not part of nature. So the three options, of those three options, an out-and-out dualism of two totally different things, a kind of emergent dualism where you just have the same thing, but you put it on a time scale, it just emerges, the light bulb of consciousness is somehow switched on in the course of history.
But a very puzzling thing that this moment should occur.
Yes. Yeah. Or you have the standard materialism with the hard problem.
Is there another term to throw in here that might be helpful? I wonder what you make of this one, what's sometimes referred to as dual aspect monism. So the idea is that there is one thing behind everything, one substance or whatever the proper word would be, but it has two different forms, and that we experience these two aspects. So we experience the material and we experience the mental. Quite how one gets at what lies behind everything is another question, but this would seem to be another variety of materialism, at least.
Well, I don't see the difference between that and what Whitehead was saying. He was saying that everything has a mental and a physical pole. But you see, the standard form of dual aspect monism makes it sound as if we know about the causal nature of things in the physical world. If you say that minds can make a difference, that they can make choices and be causes, then they have to act on the material side. And the problem with that is that it really just collapses back into the hard problem. The beauty of Whitehead's system is that they influence each other. The physical and the mental pole influence each other. They influence each other in time, and implicitly, the future pole, which is inhabited by the mind or the mental aspect of things, which makes choices, then influences what happens. And it's a kind of influence, a causal influence that works backwards in time from a virtual future towards the present, whereas regular physical causation works from the past towards the present. So you've got two causal flows that sort of overlap in the present. So you can see how there can be a causal interaction between them. Whereas dual aspect, a plain, common or garden dual aspect monism without any further elaboration, just is simply another way of stating the hard problem.
That's very clear, thank you. Of course, we could go at this question from the other angle. We could say, rather than dropping the ideal bit, the mental bit, and we could go with that bit, and maybe try a form of idealism that would actually have been much more common throughout the history of ideas, I think, a kind of Platonic idea, or an idea from Plotinus, that it's the mental that is fundamental, and matter is some kind of manifestation or emanation of the ideas, and so that we in the modern world have just got it the wrong way round. Do you buy that idea at all?
Well, not really, because the problem with Plotinus and Plato is that they had the idea of a transcendent realm of ideal forms. It was a kind of eternal idealism. It worked very well when people thought that God's mind was eternal. But if we have a radically evolutionary universe, which we do, I believe, then to say that it's all just producing ideas from outside time, that they're in a timeless realm, won't work. If there's going to be an interactive mind with evolution, it has to make things up as it goes along and have a kind of memory. And my own view is that there is a kind of memory in nature, that the formative principle is not a transcendent idea, as in Plato or Plotinus, but a formative field, which I call morphic fields, with a kind of inherent memory, and that these evolve along with nature.
I'm going to absolutely take that, and we need to discuss the possible radical evolutionary nature of the universe more fully, because it is quite a claim, as you said yourself, it is a belief at the moment. But just on this business about the atheist, do you think you could have an atheist idealist? So, for example, they wouldn't believe there was a God behind it all, but they might believe in a non-divine theory of forms, mathematics, for example, that might be the ideal form that's shaping everything. And of course, physicists work in mathematics; it is their regular stuff. So it has a sort of plausibility in that way.
Well, I think that many physicists and mathematicians and theoretical physicists are actually Platonists or Pythagoreans. They think that there is a kind of eternal mathematical reality that this world somehow reflects. I think that worked perfectly well when they believed the universe was eternal. But we now have a radically evolutionary universe. It was only since 1966 the habits of thought of physicists and mathematicians haven't really changed much. They haven't really adapted to this new situation. And I don't think it works very well in an evolutionary universe.
So you feel that once eternity goes, as it were, then that calls into question any kind of idealism?
Yes. And so the thing is that I think that if we take this dual aspect materialism you were talking about, or monism, or if we take the Galen and Strawson's idea of panpsychic materialism, where there's a kind of mentality in atoms, in molecules, and so on, then this would presumably extend all the way up. You'd have it in the sun, in the galaxy, and indeed in the entire universe. And so if the entire universe has a dual aspect, a mind as well as a body, a mental as well as a physical aspect, which is after all what Spinoza proposed, it's not a new idea, then how does this differ from pantheism?
So this is the idea that the sum total of the universe would in some sense be godlike, at least, but within this materialist frame.
Well, it would have a mind. If the whole universe has a body, then the whole universe has a kind of mind that includes everything within it. Then the mind of the universe would be godlike in the sense that gods are usually thought of as being conscious beings with a more embracing or inclusive consciousness.
The sum total of everything.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, that's taking us out onto another speculative leap, I guess. But it follows from the logic, of course. I wonder whether this is worth, again, for the sake of this conversation, covering off another possibility. Maybe this is actually related. It's sometimes referred to as non-reductive materialism. And it's the idea that one of the problems with materialism is that it's been reductionist in its tendencies. It's tend to look for the smallest parts and then put things back together again. But maybe we need to look at things on sort of from above, at the holistic level too, still within a materialistic frame, but understand that there might be top-down causation, for example, and that emergence might be being pulled up as well as just emerging from the bottom up.
Well, a kind of holistic materialism has already been tried, of course, on a big scale in the form of Marxism, or at least in the theory of dialectics of nature by Engels, which was the basis of the materialist theory taught in the Soviet Union during the communist period, and perhaps still in China, I don't know. But what made Soviet dialectical materialism different from Western reductive materialism was precisely that it postulated the emergence of new and higher levels of organization through conflicts, or in nature there'd be the emergence of a new level of wholeness. And so it was a non-reductive materialism. So I would say non-reductive materialism has been tried as a large-scale philosophy with enormous amount of funding, and it's been put into a large scientific program in the Soviet Union and perhaps in China. Whether it's in practice any different from regular materialism, it would be hard to say. I
guess that in the scientific field, in the sense of investigating the natural world rather than trying to run a society scientifically, people who are putting forward non-reductive materialism are seeking it as an explanatory tool in the way that science would be regularly, and maybe that's got some way to go yet to see whether it is fruitful as an explanatory tool.
Well, I think we have to have a holistic view of nature. I mean, my own view is holistic. I think that at each level there's morphic fields which are more than the sum of the parts, and that's why it's non-reductive. There's a whole series of levels of organization: cells, tissues, organs, organisms, societies, ecosystems, planets, solar systems, galaxies, and so on. There's always a higher level of organization within which any given system exists, and that system itself includes lower level systems. Now, that's been put forward by all sorts of holistic thinkers from Whitehead onwards, including general systems theory, which is a form of non-reductive holism. So I think it's possible to have a non-reductive materialism. I don't think materialism has to be reductive. But it still leaves open the question of where does the mind fit in, because the key point of materialism is that it says the mind's nothing but the activity of matter.
And this is where you would personally resort to the Whiteheadian view about poles and axes.
Yes, I think that's the most promising explanation.
So you wouldn't call yourself a materialist?
No, because I think that the materialism, at least as we've historically known it, tries to exclude consciousness from its explanations, even if it has more sophisticated holistic explanations instead of the crass reductionist types that we're more familiar with.
And you warm more to the word panpsychism.
Yes, I think the word panpsychism is a better way of looking at the possibility that there are organizing principles throughout nature. My own theory is that these organizing principles are fields, and the fields work by attractors. Because even if we say that they have a kind of mind, then it's the question of how does the mind work. Unless, if we don't think of it as something miraculous, we have to be able to describe how it works. And the interesting thing is that panpsychism uses the word psyche, which was the Greek word for soul. And Aristotle thought that souls work by attraction. They work by having a kind of future goal that attracted things towards them. So it already implied some kind of theory as to how this works.
So that's an interesting reflection there, because the word soul, of course, has got very mixed up with religious ideas, whereas Aristotle, in his natural philosophy, used it in really quite an unreligious sort of way. It just meant that which is capable of movement.
That's right, and the soul in Aristotle was a part of nature, the soul of an oak tree that enabled it to grow into an oak tree, giving it its form and attracting it towards the mature form of the tree, was not miraculous or outside nature, it was part of nature.
So just to return to the question with which we started, is materialism inherently atheistic? The answer really is no, then.
Not if you have a more sophisticated... Well, in its everyday form that we usually encounter it, I think it is, yes.
Because it's designed to exclude the spirit.
It's designed to exclude the spirit, and historically that's been one of its attractions to many of its supporters. But if we move on to a more sophisticated kind of panpsychist view, or a non-reductive or a holistic materialism, then I suppose the question becomes, is it really materialism? Is panpsychism really materialism, or would it be better described as animism?
That sounds like a question for another day. Rupert Sheldrake, thank you very much indeed.